My more regular contributions to Django started in, I think, 2014, when I picked up every other bug in the migrations framework that was about to be released. And in 2015, the core team decided they were too lazy to merge my pull request and made me do it myself, which made me become a core developer. That was 2015. Since April, I'm working as a senior software engineer at LaterPay in Munich. At LaterPay, we tried to make online purchasing and selling of goods more easy. And our entire idea behind the process is that it should be really, really convenient for you as a client of our merchants to buy digital goods. And the idea behind, which is also part of the name, is you are served first and pay later, similar to the way when you go into a restaurant and order dinner. Now back to the topic, SSL, all the things. Ever since Snowden revealed that the NSA is, well, spying on all of us, and that the security and the urge for security increased pretty much, especially over in Germany, where we have really huge and high data security and privacy standards. And that applies to many other European countries as well. And, well, there's a risk of, for example, in publicly unencrypted Wi-Fis where people might be able to wiretap on the network communications you have, which might be the email communication you have. And depending on how the email server is set up or your client is set up, this might be the business emails where you reveal the purchase of whatever other company you do. And, well, you don't want this. You want the owner of the cafe next door or any other person who is in the cafe to be able to wiretap on your communication. And, yeah, so there's some need for encryption there. I mean, you also don't want internet service providers to inject advertisements into your website, which is otherwise ad-free. So this is something that happens. We have that in Germany, which is really scary and a bad user experience. And not to mention, from a security perspective, that is really awful. But before we go into any details, I need to tell you something more. There's a disclaimer. I'm not a cryptographer. All the examples I give here are to the best of my knowledge. If I don't know something, I talk to people I'm trusting that know more about the stuff than I do and ask them, therefore, their opinion, which still means we are all human and there might be errors in there. TLDR, if you spot something in the slides that's clearly wrong, please talk to me after the talk outside. I will update the slides appropriately before I publish them. This talk will not cover everything you know about SSL, or you need to know about SSL, TLS, and stuff. That would be too much for one talk and would probably be enough for an entire conference. Also, if you think of SSL or hear SSL and TLS, I probably always mean TLS, SSL being just the common term for both of them. SSL 2 and 3 are broken, do not use them. TLS 1.0 and 1.1 are discouraged, and you probably should not use them either, but they are at least better than SSL. And future-looking cryptographers at Google came up with the implementation of a post-quantum cryptographic algorithm a couple of days or weeks ago, which is called New Hope, yes, after the Star Wars film. SSL stands for Secure Socket Layer, TLS for Transport Layer Security, but, well, this is just words. They are both cryptographic protocols for communication systems, most notably networks. And either of them provides 2 out of 3 parts of the topic of information security. The first one being confidentiality, which is provided through encryption, which means nobody else can read what is being transmitted. The other one is integrity, which is provided through signing, which means nobody else can change what you send without the receiver noticing. The third part of information security is availability, which is something you need to handle on a different layer. For example, scaling and redundancy in your service. But this is something these 2 protocols cannot provide. Well, now that we are at DjangoCon, most of the things we do with Django these days are websites, let's start with talking about what you need to do to get a website running. And this is obviously a web server. And a web server configuration is something which is the first step where your client, where the browser of a user speaks SSL with when talking to your website. So let's look at what you need to define or configure in your web server to make SSL working and get it up and running. And well, let's start with Apache 2 because it comes first in the alphabet. You need to switch on the SSL engine, which happens with this line. Then you want to define a cipher suite, which is something I took from CipherList, one of those websites that provide security standards and recommendations. You want to make sure that also the ciphers, the connection between the client and your server, is going to use the ciphers you want, not that the client wants, because that would mean the client is able to, or somebody might be able to reduce the security of that connection. And well, you also want to not use SSL, as said before. Apache 2.4 already disables SSL 2 by default or doesn't even support it anymore. So excluding SSL 3 might be just enough. But well, you might also want to exclude TLS 1.0 and 1.1. And well, then you define the server key and the server certificate. And last but not least, there's a thing called Diffie-Hellman parameter, which is used for the initial key exchange between the browser and your server. And setting a custom one there is also probably a good idea. When you look at the Nginx configuration, well, that pretty much looks the same. Now, the question arises, where the hell do we get this certificate from that I was just talking about? And this is where Let's Encrypt comes into play. What the heck is Let's Encrypt, you might ask yourself. And how does this entire SSL thing works anyway? And well, this is a huge, complex topic that I tried to break down in this talk. And let's start off with how SSL works, or how does your browser know that the communication it does with the server is actually trustworthy? And for that, let's start with what CAs are. CA stands for Certificate Authority. And these are trusted entities we or our browsers rely on in order to establish a so-called chain of trust. Browsers or email clients on any other client that has encrypted communication with a server have a so-called pre-installed list of so-called root certificates. And this list is created by the browser or email client vendors such as Google and Mozilla. And this list is trusted by them and is called the so-called trust store. The root certificate authorities then go ahead and normally sign so-called intermediate certificates, which are then used to sign the certificate you use for your website, for example. They're not signing your website or your certificate with their root certificate, but with a certificate in between. And we can see the reason for that when we look to the right with root CA 2 and 3. As you can see, root CA 3 is not in the trust store. So browsers don't necessarily trust the intermediate certificate that was signed by that CA. However, if the second CA so-called cross-signs this intermediate certificate, you have a chain of trust from here over there to a certificate you would use on your server, and well, the connection is trusted. And well, Let's Encrypt is one of these certificate authorities that is not trusted, or not in a trust store, at least not yet. And well, they have some another CA that trusts them, which is called IdenTrust. And since Let's Encrypt has control over their intermediate certificate, they can still sign whatever website they want, and your browser is going to trust that. This is probably a good idea, not necessarily a good idea, but given some security measures in the back end, in the background, this is probably a good idea in this, context. And well, Let's Encrypt offers an API to get pretty much unlimited certificates for a domain you have that is under your control. And under your control means you need to be able to provide something on port 80 via HTTP. By now, Let's Encrypt provided more than 5 million certificates, and they set up like 1.5 to 2 years ago, which is pretty impressive. Now let's look at the process in which you get one of those certificates. And this process is called ACME, or Automatic Certificate Management Environment. It's a fairly simple JSON API with some crypto magic that I'm not going to explain in detail. But the entire process only has like 4 steps. And there are 3 things you need for this process. One being an account key, which is something you need to that you use to authenticate yourself or your server against the Let's Encrypt. A certificate key, which is the one you put in your Apache or Nginx configuration, and a certificate signing request, which includes all the domains you want to be signed in your certificate. So the API starts with, well, here I am, this is my key, please register me or authenticate me if I'm already registered. You can provide an email address, for example, there, or a pager number in case your certificate is going to expire, but these are optional parts. Then there's this certificate signing request that you send over, and as a response, Let's Encrypt is going to provide you with a bunch of challenges. These challenges you're writing to a web server directory under a provided name with a specific content Let's Encrypt is going to provide you. And in the next step in this that you have here, you're telling Let's Encrypt, okay, I'm done, I've written all the challenges, and Let's Encrypt is going to request all those challenges on those domains via port 80, what I just said. So when you have control over a domain, you are able to provide content under a certain domain. If you don't have the content, or if you don't have the control over that domain, you can't provide the content, which means this step is secure. And well, lastly, you request the certificate from Let's Encrypt once Let's Encrypt checked all the challenges. And that's pretty much all the magic that Let's Encrypt does. Well, this is the bare configuration of how you would include or how you would define the challenge directory, for example. So there's this, Let's Encrypt is going to request something on well-known ACME challenges. So this is the directory or path in the URL you have to provide. And everything else is pretty much explained in there. And well, just for completion, the same for Nginx. Now that we know how Let's Encrypt is working, how do we actually use it? And well, there's an official client which does all the magic. Literally, it rewrites your Apache config if you wanted to. And well, they are also working, as far as I know, on the implementation for Nginx. And well, while this might be a good idea for people who just start with server management, this is probably a bad idea for enterprises, at which point you want to use configuration and system management tools. For the reasoning there, please watch my talk from 2015 PyCon Australia. There's a script called ACME Tiny by Daniel Rösler, which is like 200 lines, give or take. It's easy to understand, and it does exactly those 4 steps I showed before. It's a really recommended read if you want to start looking at Let's Encrypt. This gives you a really good idea of how it's working. I forked that project and added systemd support and a few other things. And if this exact implementation doesn't work for you, well, go ahead, fork it, and adjust it as you want. There's also a bunch of other tools. For example, Let's Encrypt AWS by Alex Gaynor, which, as the name suggests, supports or implements AWS support. There's a tool called rproxy by Amber Brown, which is a reverse proxy, which just does all the magic. You only define the domains and nothing else. And well, this is the script we use I use for my websites, and we use at Django project. You provide the information I said you need to, and be done with it. You run this every month or so. The certificates provided by Let's Encrypt have a maximum expiration lifetime of 90 days, which also means that in case something happens, you're lost for 90 days, but then the certificate is invalid anyway, and nobody can use it. Being at DjangoCon, there's actually not much we need to adjust in Django to make SSL work. That's one thing or two things you might want to adjust, or I recommend you want to adjust, which are the secure settings for two cookies, which is the session cookie and the CSRF cookie. And also, you probably don't want to run your website on HTTP and HTTPS, only HTTPS. If you want to go into further details on what things you could possibly set, have a look at this, this list of features Django supports out of the box in terms of SSL. It does a lot of features that you probably, when you use Nginx or Apache, would not do in Django, but as part of the reverse proxy in front. And well, let me go through those things in the next couple of minutes. Let's Encrypt certificates, as briefly mentioned, are valid for 90 days. If you lose them or if they are compromised, you can revoke them via an API call. Same applies for your account key. If you lose that, you can change that and be safe again. If you lose your certificate key, well, this is the same as if the certificate is compromised. You should get a new key, get a new signing request, get a new certificate, and you're done. Well, you probably want to revoke the key as well, but yeah. Then there's a thing called HTTPS, or HTTPStrict transport security, which means your browser is, after the first visit to the HTTPS site, is only ever going to request an HTTPS version of this site and not even trying HTTP. Which means if you turn it on and turn it off and disable SSL, then all the browsers that went to this website before cannot access it anymore because you don't have SSL anymore. So if you enable it, be sure about what you do there. There's a similar thing called HPKP, HTTP public key pinning, which works on a slightly separate level. It's probably not too useful for most people, only ever when you have like a really big organization or company and are subject to DNS attacks or so. It has the same drawbacks as HSTS, that it's not ever going to be, your clients won't be able to connect if this changes or if you lose the configuration there. You can use you can use Let's Encrypt or the certificates provided by Let's Encrypt for any kind of other service that uses SSL by just providing a service that supplies these challenges on port 80 for that domain. That's it. You get the certificate for that domain, put it wherever you use it, and be done with it. For example, I use it myself for my IRC bouncer. Well, speaking of cryptography, things can go wrong, and things can go horribly wrong, and there's no finite list of things that could go wrong. HSTS, HPKP, if you want to use it, please be aware of the downsides and what could possibly happen and how bad you can break your site. But you probably want to use it. So this is kind of a trade-off. Speaking of cryptography, you have keys, and well, occasionally you will leak a key, probably or hopefully only ever once, or well, hopefully never, but it's going to happen to everybody. So you want to be able to, want to have a process in place to revoke keys. And as said before, Let's Encrypt has that implemented and has the feature there. Just be aware of that how you handle that. People say SSL or TLS that uses lots more of resources. Yes, of course, it does need more resources and computation power, but honestly, that doesn't really matter if any of the more or less modern hardware. So let's say the last 4 years probably is you probably don't going to recognize it. Here's an incomplete list of sources. The first one was briefly mentioned before, cipher list. It's a good recommendation for use these ciphers and use, well, this is a configuration you might want to use. The second one is probably your go-to page if something with your SSL configuration is broken, or if you want to see how good or bad you configured your web servers. Seriously, this is the reference tool from my perspective for, is my SSL set up correctly? And then there's a couple of blog posts and other resources of how to use or not to use SSL. Thank you.
So we do have time for some questions. If you have a question, please come down to the mic for the recording purposes. We've got about 5 minutes.
Hey, amigo, how you doing? If you turn on the secure cookies, I had 2 minor questions. 1, how does run server handle that? And 2, if you have to share your cookies from Django with a legacy code base across your domain, say Cold Fusion, how does that work as well?
1, you don't. So, which is the reason why I had the environment variables in here. So this is something you want to set in production, but you don't want to use in development, because development is not going to work unless you set local SSL setup, which is kind of a pain point. The other one I didn't really get.
If I have a domain, say wharton.upenn.edu with 2 subdomains, like vagrant.wharton.upenn.edu and coldfusion.wharton.upenn.edu, how do I share a cookie across wharton.upenn.edu if secure? Does it still work across the entire domain if you set the cookie for .wharton.upenn.edu and not the actual server?
I'm not too sure, to be honest.
Okay.
Read up in the documentation. It should be in there. Otherwise, at least, if it's not, this is probably a topic, something we should add to the documentation as a possible problem. And there are sprints. Please submit a ticket and possibly a patch.
Will do. Somebody should also totally do a lightning talk called, "Oh crap, I just committed my Django secret key."
That's also a good idea.
All right, 2 more questions.
Sort of similar to the last one, but different case. Let's say let's say you use a bunch of vendors, possibly ad servers, analytics vendors, and they're not running on HTTPS. Any suggestions on how you can still protect your site, or is it just
if ad companies or ad networks don't provide SSL, there's not much you can do except for either live with, oh, your site uses insecure content, or not use SSL. I might even err on this side of, well, your site uses insecure content, or hope for the people to use ad blockers and not load the content. I don't know. No, honestly, there's not much you can do. At least the major ad networks, as far as I read a couple of weeks ago, they are slowly moving over to HTTPS.
right slowly?
Yeah, sorry.
Hi, I was wondering if you've used Let's Encrypt's built-in certbot utility, and if there's any advantages or disadvantages to using the ACME Tiny instead.
The Let's Encrypt official client does too much magic from my perspective. I only want to get my certificates and deal with the rest myself, or with tools that are meant to deal with that. So no, I haven't used anything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, 1 more round of applause for Markus.